Well, good afternoon, evening. With the, shift in time and daylight, it feels a little earlier than perhaps it really is, but I want to welcome you to tonight's event. I'm Shanna Benjamin, Professor of African American Studies here at Wake, and on behalf of the program in African American Studies, where we pride ourselves on cultivating a distinctive intellectual community in the spirit of pro humanitate, I'm honored to introduce my friend, colleague, and Sarah, Dr. Therí Pickens. Tonight, Dr. Pickens will be in conversation with me about her debut poetry collection, What Had Happened Was. I'd like to thank also WGSS, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, English and Creative Writing for co-sponsoring this event along with the program in African American Studies. Therí A. Pickens received her undergraduate degree in comparative literature from Princeton and her PhD in comparative literature from UCLA. Her online biography explains that she is a poet scholar who focuses on Arab American studies, Black studies, comparative literature, and disability studies. As her rightly biased sister scholar, I'm here to tell you that she is an intellectual and creative virtuoso, committed to elevating the written word in her scholarship and her poetry. In addition to authoring Black Madness, Mad Blackness, a tour de force that fundamentally shaped foundational theoretical frameworks in Black disability studies, she also edited special collections on Black disability studies in two major journals, African American Review and the College Language Association Journal. These publications ushered in new conversations about Black disability studies and cemented Dr. Pickens' standing in the field. In her debut poetry collection, What Had Happened Was, Dr. Pickens investigates the complex structures of Black storytelling, addressing topics ranging from Black life, popular culture, and history, to individual encounters with emotion, love, and chronic disability. Pickens crafts and questions the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we want to be. Throughout this collection, Pickens mines the formal structures and the play of Black English within the lives and afterlives of Harriet Tubman, Mary J. Blige, Lil' Kim, Breonna Taylor, and figments of our collective imagination. Her singular poetic voice effortlessly flows between what she knows and what she's heard, and between everyday Black conversation and her work in cultural criticism and disability studies. Traveling at the speed of thought, Pickens explores a praxis of storytelling governed by the places where truths and fables kiss. Dr. Pickens, it's really a dream to be able to publicly engage in conversation with you because, generally speaking, it gives students and colleagues a sneak peek into how professors engage as scholars and colleagues. It also offers a window into how Black women in the academy love on and support one another. We won't give it all away because we know that silences and selective withholdings are important and necessary, but I offer the latter as another reason why sitting down with you is such a gift to me and the Wake Forest community. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the stage, Dr. Therí Pickens.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm new at this poetry reading thing, but one of the things I thought I couldn't do without was to pour out a libation for the people who didn't see me reach this moment. And it's something that we do across the world in various communities, but usually it's with alcohol, but water will do. And this is for my people, for your people, for the people. All right. So I'm going to start with one that I think some folks in here will know. Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced, nor cried aloud under the bludgeoning of chance. My head is bloodied, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms with the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Invictus by William Ernest Henley. So in the first poems I memorized, and because I pledged Delta Sigma Theta, we had to know it. But I knew it at 5 because my father is a Q and my whole life was a hazing process. So there are things that we know. So because that poem is largely about where we sit in history, I want to retell a familiar story with a poem. This one is a drop title, and it is called, does everyone know what a drop title means? No, okay, so a drop title is when the first line of the poem is also the title. Right? So you have the title that's there, and it doesn't repeat. You're just supposed to read it as one continuous poem. Okay. If Lyndon B. Johnson hadn't had his heart attack, the expert says the Voting Rights Act would not have been signed. Above her head, the picture of MLK and LBJ adjacent to the picture of Douglas and Lincoln, one man standing, petitioning on the right, and the white one seated. His pen stroking the paper, penetrating ink, changing the makeup of the world. His word means something. And the other is waiting, waiting, waiting. LBJ wrote with his right hand, which means the pain jiggered up his opposite arm and electrified his shoulder first, before it felt like his heart was like the stores on the news, then the terrible, terrible quiet of not speaking, of not breathing. Others rush always too slowly, always rather deliberately. To his face, he hears echoing voices from bodies that scurry, rats finding the place of least resistance or even succor. In an epiphany, he has, after nitroglycerin and some rest, for rest always brings clarity, he tells the world how to get well again. He tells the world how to write itself again. He strokes the pen. He changes the world with his word. The expert says that was the moment, the exact moment he knew he needed to act. I heave up from my belly the air to expel out my nostrils, a gust of wind and water and salt, cleanse the space that holds this history. I too am standing as best I can in this history. I've stood and sat with pens trying to stroke the world, seduce the words, thrust some sense into it all. I prick the paper until it bleeds. Some precious ink, and at least I find empathy without looking in the mirror. You can clap now. So yeah, this is the experience I've been having. People have not known when the poem is over. So now that I know I'm going to have that experience here, I will step away from the chair so you know the poem is over. Okay. All right, so how many of you remember lockdown, like vivid memories of COVID lockdown? Yeah? Okay. Some of you are like, I want to forget, and I don't want to raise my hand. But there's a scholar, a sister scholar friend of ours named Duchess Harris. And Duchess, that's her real name, she describes COVID as COVID-16-19 because in March, everyone with a certain degree of privilege was suggesting that we would have a lovely long pause, that we were going to meditate and we were going to exercise and all this other stuff that folks thought that they were going to be able to do because the world was on pause for a second. And then the news happened, right? Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Botham Jean, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wrote a piece that I think, is trying to capture something about those 3 months between March and June of 2020. And this one's called Variation on a Theme. It is in here somewhere. Okay, here we go. And it goes after Gwendolyn Brooks. It's a golden shovel. So golden shovel means that you take a poem and you kind of explode it across the page. So every word from one line or from the entire poem, in this case, is on the left-hand side of the page, and then it flows to the right. Right? So if it was out of the night that covers me, the first line would start with out, second line would start with of. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? Okay. So it's a golden shovel on We Real Cool. Variation on a theme. We tired. 2 syllables. No R. We real tired because we tried to listen for real. Cool? Not for play. We kept our cool. We keep trying to save ourselves. We left our own selves behind in case things went left. School must reopen, they say. We can't reopen school. We keep other folks and other things in mind. We lurk in our homes and behind masks, lurk late at night in our trembling thoughts. Lately, we think about all the kinds of work we do. Strikes seem a good idea. Back in the day, striking straightened up a company, so here's some straight talk. We telling you, we feel this apocalypse in our bones. We sing to thee of Shine and his hustle. We be singing sinfully all them low notes about keeping a peace. Since we know ain't nobody thinking about us, we, thin-boned and called essential, a lie so thin, genuine care slips through, plus vermouth, lemon, bitters, gin. We toast the inevitable because we know. We jazz up the coming breathlessness. We listen for March jazz in June. We've been in the house since March. It's June. We know there may not be an end, for if we must die, we choose which monster murders us. Some of us will die soon. Okay. I got one more poem about that time. This one kind of in conversation with the libation that I poured out at the beginning. This one is trying to honor the sanctity of Black life and Black love. On March 12th, is also a drop title. On March 12th, 2020, Breonna Taylor awakened after working 4 overnight shifts at the local ER. With its loud flashes and staccato lights, a hustle she said was going to make 2020 the year of Breonna Taylor, and it is. A beautiful thing that she and Kenny did what all young couples should get the chance to, that is spend the day just chilling, chat at supper time over decent barbecue. That is the best you can get outside family, and decide between playing high-stakes Uno or watching a movie what all young couples should get the chance to when they don't choose. And do both, as they munch freshly baked cookies and ice cream that is the warm dough hugging the cold sugar wet, before the movie starts, watching them curled up in bed and not know what no young couple should get the chance to. That is what interrupts their feeling of just us, what all waits outside their love. So throughout the collection, there are what I like to call companion pieces. So pieces that are meant to be read together, even though in the table of contents they may be further apart. Where shall I? How are you all feeling? You feel like you want to talk about children, or you want to talk about accountability? How are you feeling? I could go either way. Dealer's choice. Yes. Okay, so this one is called Ode to Checking My Shit. And it's largely about accountability. But it is after a poet whose name is Ross Gay. And he is, I don't know, I think this might be a nickname only I have given him, but I call him the Poet of Delight because he's got 2 books on delight, the Book of Delight and the Book of More Delights. And apparently a lot of his delights are around his height. He's about 6'3", I believe, and his urination and fruit. These are the things that give him delight. And so I thought a scatological poem might be something that might make him laugh. Oh, sorry. Scatological means kind of waste from the body. So excrement, urine, tears, spit, etc. I've got a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll read the poem. All right, so Ode to Checking My Shit after Ross Gay. As I watch nurses turn their noses up and CNAs avoid the conversation with words never uttered out loud and ideas only vaguely gestured at, like they don't know what I mean or I don't know what they mean, and as doctors never ask, but I tell them anyway, I never think to withhold, to play my vagues, but rather watch how color, texture, size create this moment of recoil. Sometimes one will admit they've never heard such detail, such self-knowledge with a straight face, like the years of therapy paid off, like the person harangued for years to pay attention to her body finally got it right. When I peer over the bowl as though a microscope lay between us, a set of lenses which, as at the ophthalmologist's, tell me better or worse or about the same, I straighten my back and curve my smile several times a day and watch the small islands settle like Atlantis must have, housing whole worlds of tiny organisms and the detritus that used to be food and sometimes still is. I make sure to note how I unload these burdens, whether it takes the shape where it now lives in the S-bend, or if it is like it used to be, a scattered shot in the dark, rushed to and screaming with electricity, or if it feels empty, like when it used to come unbidden into a bag. I relish the candle doing its work, cleansing the air, setting fire to some evidence that I lived, but not the moment of relief to look back at what I consumed and let go, thinking maybe there's something there worth savoring. The companion poem to that one is obviously one about washing your hands. And so if you pick up the collection, you can read that one. Let's see. How are we doing on time?
I wasn't keeping it.
All right. So I am a child of the 90s. And there were a lot of pop princesses in the 90s, right? Some of them have grown up now. But there used to be a voice that they were kind of forced to talk into, a sort of whiny, tremulous voice, right? So Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera has always defied this notion. She always likes to speak in her lowest register so that she sounds serious. Jessica Simpson also talked in this voice. One of the reasons why this fascinates me is because it's one of the ways that women at that time, particularly white women, were policed. That their tone of voice had to indicate some degree of compliance to patriarchy, some degree of complicity with their oppression. Mm-hmm. And for Black girls who ended up taking on that voice because that was who they were around, or that was how they chose to express themselves, or they liked Clueless, there's always a sense of thinking of those people as stupid. And I chafe against that because I was always around young women who did that, and you find out sometimes belatedly that they are actually quite smart. And so I wrote this piece to kind of think about what that voice does. This piece is called Ranunculus. So I'm sitting in Anna Maria's house, right, in her living room, right? So like she's got this gorge wooden table, like oak or cedar or something, and on it is this candle, and I'm like, whoa, a candle. But just as you don't think I'm crazy, it's like nearly down to its little emerald nub, but like just enough for dinner. And then this killer little glass holder that looks like it's got a better figure than me, like for real. And next to it, like right next to it, is a bottle with 3 flowers, but like the bottle was old school liquor, like hard liquor bottle with one of those crow masks on it, like the one you see in sex dungeons. I mean, not that I've ever been to a sex dungeon or whatever, but like I've got HBO. So anyway, 3 flowers in there, one white with like rose tips. The flower totally has a French mani situation. And then behind it is this little pink number that looks like a tutu, but in the center, it's like, that's the one that kills me because it's such a little star in this French little liquor bottle turned vase, or is it vase, whatever. So there's this fuchsia flower, the color of that little number I like to wear in August. Just enough red and just enough sex, and it is totally setting off the olive in the curtains, all that matte in the candle. The light is looking so pretty outside as it goes down, but back to this flower. It's a peony. No, it's a ranunculus. Really sounds like a disease. And the petals are interlaid like shingles on a roof. The ranunculus is just clutching them so tight, and all I can think to ask the flower is, please, Tell me, little ranunculus, tell me all of your pretty secrets.
We're good for one more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do folks remember The Cosby Show? Anyone know what happened in the first episode? First episode. Ooh. Theo, yes. So the thing about The Cosby Show is that every show, every sitcom, every drama is trying to work out some degree of anxiety, right? So if you ever watch Sweet Magnolias on Netflix, they're trying to work out what it is to have a modern South. But they fall into a lot of these stereotypes because the writers kind of can't get outside of their own heads sometimes. If you ever watch something like A Different World, it's about what do middle class aspirations mean for students at HBCUs. And for The Cosby Show, it was what do middle class aspirations mean for folks who are part of a black middle class, right? And how is it that they navigate what it means to be a part of a black middle class? So in addition to The Cosby Show having a kind of overarching anxiety, as all television shows do, the thing you need to know about TV during the 80s is that every sitcom usually had a very special episode. Someone was doing drugs, someone was caught drinking, right? Vanessa decided to have big fun one day and she got caught drinking, right? And the very special episodes die out because during the 90s, television was not meant to have such a teaching-heavy, what's the word I'm looking
Component.
for?
Component.
Component, yes, thank you. And in addition to that, you had on a lot of white television shows, a father and a son having a heart-to-heart. And usually the father is trying to teach the son something, right? Something about money, something about relationships, something about responsibility, something about what it means to be a man. And usually in those exchanges between white men and white boys, the son teaches the father something. So The Cosby Show takes that idea and turns it on its head during the first episode. So Theo gets like a D in something, or, is underperforming at school. And this is before they write dyslexia into the character of Theo. And so Theo says, I don't want to be like you and mom. You and mom are doctors and lawyers. I just want to be regular people. And so Cliff takes Monopoly money. And he's like, if you want to be regular people, tell me how you're going to survive. And so he gives him, whatever the salary is. And he takes a 15% just off top. He's like, the government comes for regular people first, right? FICA, Social Security, Uncle Sam. So he takes that. And then he's like, where are you going to live, right? Theo goes, I'll live in New Jersey. And then they go down the line. What are you going to wear? How are you going to drive, et cetera? And then he's like, well, so Theo has money, and Cliff is like, what are you going to wear? So Theo, Cliff takes like $50 or something. And Theo gives him an extra 50. He's like, I want to look good, right? And then he has $200 left. And Cliff goes, well, you have a girlfriend. And he's like, yes. And Cliff snatches the $200 away, right? So this moment is a turning on its head of this idea of what masculinity is meant to look like and what the relationship between father and son is meant to be, that it is supposed to be a top-down relationship, right? So gone are these kind of heart-to-hearts where the son is teaching the father something. And gone are these moments when they are, the son has no embarrassment, right? Where the son comes out on top, right? So this was my reaction to this. What Cliff should have told Theo on the pilot of The Cosby Show, September 1984. In the pilot, there was no Princeton-going Sandra, the eldest Huxtable kid who would have been in the same cohort as Michelle. But there was no screen time available for black misfits, neither from Chicago nor Brooklyn. And Sandra never brought home any friends, only that sad-ass Alvin. Theo's desire to be regular people would later be called self-actualization, but would never be called by its proper name, except in black circles. Vanessa's dour character would never improve in 8 seasons, nor would her hair. When Theo is calculating his monthly income, he does not factor in whether he will get paid bi-weekly, how many busted rubbers result in paternity, and stop and frisk. There will also be an emotional cost to realizing you've squandered what wealth fictional black parents built against the odds still. Even in the language of Quaaludes, no won't never not be no. Claire's career is not on screen. She only exists in the kitchen and the bedroom, so her being an attorney is not apparent. Only Theo's mouth takes her outside home. I brought you in this world and I can take you out was supposed to give Cliff a moment of unobtrusive Reagan-era blackness. Claire, muttering on the stairs in English and Spanish, was supposed to give her a moment of unobtrusive Reagan-era blackness. Denise's first date with the merchant marine gave Lisa Bonet the wanderlust needed for her sudden departure from the port of Brooklyn to a different world, and finally her mooring in the deeply conservative embraces of Joseph C. Phillips and Raven Simonier. By the time Theo grew up, they would have gentrified New Jersey, and $200 for having a girlfriend would never have been enough.
So, I mean, I have a couple thoughts. I have several thoughts. Well, the first has to do with the fact that Bates is so lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Because I can see the pedagogy, I can see the teaching, I can see how what you know about African American literature, theory, praxis, poetry, the whole of it shows up, and conversations about music and things like that. So before I get into my self-serving curiosities about what had happened would you please tell us about how you came to this collection, which is different than what you've done before?
Sure.
But as I mentioned in my intro, I think it still displays your commitment to the clear and careful articulation of thoughts through language.
Sure. So I started writing poetry when I was 8 years old. So my first workshop was in undergrad, my first year, and it was with Yusuf Kamanyaka, and he was like, he was very generous for a couple of different reasons. I was a whole hellified mess in that classroom. I was critiquing other people's poems, and I was rude, and I was like the worst student ever. And he took me aside and told me, you need to work on your craft. But he also was incredibly encouraging with the stuff that I had produced, right? Keeping in mind that, like, at the time I was 17 years old, so there wasn't enough, there wasn't for me enough knowledge about the life I had lived. Like, I had lived a life, but not enough knowledge about how to move that from being just a series of anecdotes to being poetry, because poetry is not a series of anecdotes. And I kept writing, and I had another workshop with Derek Walcott, who thought that I had promise. And then there was that one negative voice in graduate school who told me, you're not good at this. And so I put it away. I kept writing, but never showed it to anybody, thought that there was something amiss with the voice that I had. Turns out it's just a black voice, and not a voice that's interested in things like scansion, right? The unstressed, stressed, unstressed. Is everyone familiar with this? That thing that's like iambic pentameter and tetrameter and counting syllables. That's not the music I hear, because that's based on a certain kind of music. And so when I finished Black Madness, Mad Blackness, or kind of during the process of finishing it, once it was submitted to the press, I just started taking classes. I went to workshops. I contacted people who I knew, who I had paid to come to Bates, who told me they were my friends. I was like, you're gonna make good on this promise now? I'm gonna call you about every poet question I have. And they were generous. And I think the oldest poem in here is actually written in 2008. But I think for me, this is the place where, as a scholar for disability studies, I have to be precise, right? I have to differentiate between depression and cognitive disabilities and neurological and neurotypical and neurodivergent. I have to make all of those distinctions clear, because in scholarship, the role of a scholar is to clarify. The role of a poet is kind of to fuck shit up, right? Like, we do the things that that scholars then have to clarify. And so I took it upon myself to just be the poet I wanted to analyze.
Yeah. Okay. And being the poet you wanted to analyze reminds me of Morrison, of course, right? Writing the book that you want to read. And so, you know, this gives us a moment to bring in the role of Black women, scholars, intellectuals, writers. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about Barbara Christian and A Race for Theory, because you mentioned her in her in the notes.
Yeah.
And I know that she shows up all the time, right?
Yeah.
In places. So for those unfamiliar with the seminal essay by Barbara Christian, A Race for Theory, Barbara Christian was a Black woman writer, professor, scholar, feminist, and mentor who taught at UC Berkeley from the 1970s through her death in 2000. She was from the US Virgin Islands, and one of the things that's really important about the text, and I, describe this in Half and Shadow, is this way. So I describe the race for Theory as the critical movement toward privileging esoteric analyses over criticism grounded in tropes endemic to the text itself. So what does that mean? I'm basically saying that Barbara Christian was calling to task a new wave of theory and theorizing, a new wave of theory and theorizing that was gaining prominence in the 80s and 90s, where you had a lot of so-called high theory that was being applied to a wide variety of texts, and Black scholars who had just entered the academy were being faced with this challenge to either write in the ways that, the race for theory demanded, or to create the theorizing out of the text and out of the culture and out of the experience of the people. Okay, so that's Barbara Christian. That's Cliff Notes on Barbara Christian. So, with that as a backdrop, I have a question and a thought.
Yeah.
So, okay, the question is this. Would you say more about how Black feminist thought in general and Barbara Christian in particular inform the content and the form of your book?
Sure. So there's a couple of different times, I think, in my education where I felt like someone had just thrown down the gauntlet. Like some writer, some theorist was like, is this or this, right? And Barbara Christian does that in A Race for Theory. She's like, either you believe that an author is doing something theoretical, you believe that an author is creating a world, or you don't. And I don't know whether it's her or Morrison in another speech, but one of them says, I think literary critics envy mathematicians their little equations, because, many of you, it seems like, especially since y'all taking notes, it seems like somebody's in an English class here. And if you come from a science background, so I was planning to be a biochemical engineer. So I would come into English class, I'd be like, what you mean there's multiple right answers and you don't know how to tell us what they all are, right? So that idea that there's not an equation, that you have to go into the text, you have to think about context, you have to think about culture, you have to think about the fact that it slaps means one thing in 1940 than it does now, right? It slaps is not violent now, right? As opposed to at any other point in history, right? Is everybody with me so far? So Barbara Christian says either you believe the text or you don't. And my thought is either you believe Barbara Christian or you don't. So when I'm sitting there writing, I'm like, either I'm gonna make a world out of these words, or I'm gonna succumb to a training that I've had that tells me that the world making I do is not valid. And so I think she kind of sits there as like a patron saint. So on my bookshelf, everything is, you can see the spines of everything. Hers is the only one turned out. So I'm always looking at her cover at my desk, because I feel like she was the one who said, either you believe Black women or you don't. either you believe that the world that someone creates, their work, their labor, right? Because people started calling novels texts,
Yeah.
right? And I'm guilty of this too. I call them texts as well. But we moved away from calling it work, which meant that we were erasing labor. And so what that means for me is that I am forced to confront my own labor, right, in terms of the content, but also to never forget that I'm a craftsperson when I'm a poet. And I'm a scholar, but I'm also, like, I'm doing work that requires study. It's not just the transcription of my thoughts, right? It's not, oh, you know, when I call Dr. Benjamin, I'm like, guess what happened to me today, right? That's not in here. There's poetry in here, which means that at some point it started as an inspiration or a thought process, and then I have to go back and revise to make sure it's a poem.
Yeah.
And I think what Barbara Christian offers me consistently in that essay and in a few other ones is that variety, multiplicity, eroticism, they're not meant to be contained. And so I think about that as a poet, but then also I think about that as a scholar, because there are some things I'm looking to explain or contain really that can't be. So, yeah.
So from here, I'm going to go into kind of a choose your own adventure.
Sure. I'm ready.
Because, you know, hearing you talk about the fact that the cover faces out and you have Barbara Christian present in your workspace like that, it makes me think about the fact that I have a picture of Nellie McKay up in my office.
Yeah.
And in looking back and, you know, getting some of the information about Barbara Christian, as I get older and I take stock of the fact that she passed when she was 56. So there was this period of time in the early 2000s when you had Black women academics dying at, I mean, an unbelievable rate. Yearly. And, you know, as we were coming up, it's something that you heard about in literary studies, and then you start to ask yourself, you know, what are the trade-offs of this work, of this labor? What does it mean to speak truth to power? Like, what are the consequences of that? Yeah. What's the toll that it takes? And so this, it's not really a question.
Sure.
But, you know, that's door number one.
Sure.
And then second, this is related to craft. And this will probably be the last question that I ask you before we open the floor for student questions. But the second question is about your structure, which is so intentional. And I'm going to go kind of big because I think that for those of you who pick up the book, this might be kind of an easy point of access. I know how your mind works, even if I don't know why you do all the things you do.
Yeah.
So why put mind you between this, that, and the third? Yeah. So there are sections in the collection. She has this, that, mind you, and the third. So we know in the vernacular this, that, and the third, but mind you interrupts that. So I'm curious structurally, like what that turn does for you as a writer, for the collection as a whole. So
So I think both of those are intertwined for me, because part of the cost of speaking truth to power as a Black woman academic is that your cortisol levels are consistently elevated, your blood pressure goes up, you end up not necessarily being able to make healthy or home-cooked meals for yourself because you're always eating on the go, because you've got to go hither and yon, or you got this meeting behind that meeting behind this meeting, or you've got a class where none of the students want to be there and all of them are giving you grief, and they're all nice to each other in class, but in your office hours they are attacking you, right? All of these things have happened to me. And so I think settling into being able to say it how I feel it was part of the reason for this structure. Because when someone says this, that, and the third, you're usually just kind of listing off things that make sense, right? But it's never relegated to just three things. It's usually this, that, and the third is a way of saying et cetera. It's this, that, and the third is a way of saying, well, for all these reasons, I'm not speaking with this person because she did this, that, and the third at this moment, right? So I feel like the this, that, and the third was a segue to more, right? And then, mind you, always interrupts the story with some useful background information. Mind you, what had happened was so-and-so bought the house at a cheap price and then sold it to this company to make sure that, mind you, what had happened was old girl was with old boy when she shouldn't have been, like there's a whole bunch of ways that mind you allows for interruption, background information, the utility of context, right? Whenever I'm speaking to my family, I always hear mind you, because they're telling me one story and then they forget we haven't spoken in a while and they're like, mind you, what happened in 1996 was because you was, off somewhere doing XYZ, or mind you, when you were in college, she hooked up with, like there's background information to be had, right? And so linguistically, I think mind you always comes before the third act. So this, that, and the third are functioning as acts here. And mind you is always the clutch information you need before you draw a conclusion, right? Especially if when you're telling the story or when you're gossiping, you are trying to manipulate the person to see things the way that you see them. It's always, mind you, this is the thing you need to know about what I know, so you don't believe that person when they tell you their version of the story, right? And all cultures have a way of doing this, right? Because storytelling is endemic to the human experience. But I think thinking blackly, this is the way I do it. This is the way people I know do it. And so I'm certain there's another text from another culture that has similar reasoning, but this is part of it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank
Thank
you. Okay, so the floor is open for questions. What I will do is, after you ask, if you'll just introduce yourself and ask your question, what I'll do is I'll repeat it back so that we get it all the way through for the sound. So the floor is open.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Therí A, Therí Benjamin, critical for creative media. You spoke on like the one negative voice that like forced you to stop, and I wanted to know how you navigated finding your voice again.
Okay, so how you navigated finding your voice again after hearing that one negative thought. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it was that person that stopped me, because I stopped me. And that person had enough influence and power to make me kind of reconsider what my voice was going to be. But I also think that it was within my own power to say, fuck that noise. And I didn't. And so I take accountability for believing them. And I think, shout out to my therapists over the years. Shout out to my friends over the years who encouraged me to trust my voice. But I think, one of the things that made me pick poetry back up in earnest, because I never stopped writing, I just stopped showing it to people. One of the things that made me pick poetry back up in earnest was seeing one of my friends who was in that first workshop with me debut his poetry collections. And me being so excited for him, and him saying, you should be here with me. And there was a pain in that, and a utility, because it takes someone who's, got some Capricorn stubbornness and, a Sagittarius moon with some honesty. It's going to be like, why are you not here? Right. So I think that helped. I think also, in terms of pursuing the making of a book, I had to embrace my ambition. So in the first movie for Sex and the City, Carrie has like 10 books with her name, and I know it's fictional. I for real know, I know it's fictional, because no one is getting up in Abu Dhabi and singing whatever that song was and everybody's joining. I know it's fictional, but she had like 10 books with her name on it. I was like, if she can do it, why can't I? Right, so I was sitting there and I was like, okay, Carrie, because we know you don't write anything useful or helpful because you are a trash human being. I'm sorry, I'm still mad at Carrie as a character for trying to fleece Charlotte down for money and staying in a rent control department overlooking the city in New York during the, like, I don't like her, but it was inspiring. I have many opinions about television, but yeah, that, to answer your question, was helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Other questions? And it's okay if they're not fully formed.
Yeah.
If there's a thought that you'd like to articulate and something you'd like to kind of think through, I think that Dr. Pickens is, the perfect person to do that with. She knows how to riff, so feel free.
For those of you taking notes, I mean, you could feel free to tell me there you go.
Yes.
I'm Maddie. I'm a freshman. I was just wondering, which one of your works you're most proud of?
Okay.
Oh.
This question is about which one of her works she's most proud of.
They're a little like children. You kind of can't pick a favorite. And I'm not a toxic parent, so I don't have a favorite. So I'll talk about the books and the edited collections as separate. So when I think of myself as an editor, both for a developmental editing business I have, as well as someone who edits scholarly work, I think that I'm operating in the tradition of Toni Morrison and Jessie Redmond Fawcett. And so I feel like I'm part of a tradition of Black feminist editing that helps people sound more like themselves, that gives people opportunities, that allows folks to enter into a conversational space. And for every edited collection that I've done, and I've done 3, I've always used my cachet as a tenured or full professor to make sure that junior professors get put on. So that's why I'm proud of those. And I'm proud of them individually for distinct reasons, but that feels too in the weeds. So the first book, I'm proud of it because it is the first book and because it was hell to write it. Basically 10 years in the making, a dissertation turned into a book. And it was a book that people kept saying I couldn't do. Right? So it was a book about Arab and Black Americans conversing over something other than Islam. And so me being able to do that book was a fantastic middle finger to the people who kept saying, no, they don't have anything else to talk about. And I'm like, where have you been?
Housewife.
Right. Housewife. And then Black Madness, Mad Blackness was my theoretical book. And it was also a book people said I couldn't write, in part because I don't think folks were particularly interested in some of the uncomfortable conversations about Blackness and disability. Some people think Blackness and madness are synonymous, and they're not. Some people can't separate them. Some people have difficulty with ableism inside a Black community and anti-Blackness inside a disabled community. How do you bring those together? So I tried to, and I'm proud of that book for that. And this one feels like it's been a lifetime in the making. And there's some audacity here. Like, the cover is a rendering largely of Black phenotype with hair and noses and fingernails. And it is audacious, I think, in the title and in the sections, because it is a pronounced linguistically aware Blackness in a way that I think some people find objectionable, right? So we were having a conversation earlier about prizes. I'm trying to get my publisher to make sure I'm up for every single prize I can be. And there's someone at the publisher's office who's in my way. And I don't know why she's in my way, but she's going to move. And we're going to try and get this to the hands that it needs to, because it's not always about winning the prize. It's about making sure that people read the work. And so I think given the audacity in the title and in the structure and in the poems themselves, getting people to read the work, even if I don't win, means that the person who comes behind me will have an audience that's already familiar with that kind of audacity, and it won't seem quite so out the blue. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
we'll
got a
start in the
couple.
back.
Yeah.
We'll go 1, 2, 3.
Sure.
Okay, so this is a question about Dr. Pickens' disability, which is not something that one would see and notice visually, especially in the absence of the scooter, for example. And so the question was about how this has impacted her career.
Yeah.
Did I get it? Okay, all right.
So I have an autoimmune illness. It's called myasthenia gravis. It's in the same family as multiple sclerosis. So what happens is that there are antibodies in the body that attack the, how do I explain this? I know too much to actually distill it, right? So when you want your muscles to move, your brain sends a signal to the nervous system, and then the muscles contract. The traveling between the nervous system and the muscles, there's a chemical called acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine receptors in my body are the ones being attacked. Right? There are 2 antibodies that one can have for myasthenia. You can have ones that are called MuSK antibodies, and you can have ones that are called AChR antibodies. I have both. And so it makes it particularly difficult for the muscles around the lungs. So the reason why I often conserve energy is because if I run out of breath, I'm no good, right? And people will never be able to get to me quickly enough so that I can tell them with my breath what's going on. So that's one of the reasons why I conserve energy. But when thinking about autoimmune illnesses, Black women have the highest incidence of autoimmune illnesses per capita. You've got folks with, cancer is an autoimmune, you've got lupus, you've got high incidence of, heart disease, hypertension, et cetera, and then also like a bevy of, multiple sclerosis, et cetera. So I'm among a group of people who, know what that is like. And so one of the things that I try to make sure of is that there's some sort of visual reminder, in part because I don't want people to push me too far physically during a day. But what that has also meant is that, and I think anyone who teeters on the edge of any identity experiences this, whether it's teetering on the verge of looking able-bodied but knowing you are disabled, having your phenotype look one way but your parenthood says another, having your gender expression not match how you feel inside, all of those spaces where people are in liminal spaces. One of the things that you experience is folks calling you a liar, right? And people find all kinds of ways to do that because they don't understand the fiction that they're relying on to make that assessment about you. So I've had that assessment made about me on multiple occasions. The only way that I've counteracted it is by being as honest as possible. So I've hurt some feelings, but I think it's worth it for people to know this is not a lie, right? The other thing about professional circumstances is that when you're in a profession that counts on your presence, when you're not there, people notice. And so when I've spent weeks or months on end in a hospital, teaching from the hospital bed, people notice. So for 13 years, I think Bates and other scholars who I interact with just know, like, the hospital doesn't really stop much, but it does, now that everybody's on Zoom, I got access. But what that means, I think, is it's a mixed bag. So I've come to announcing what I have as a way to avoid certain backlash, but there are other people who make very different choices, which is one of the reasons why I think access being available for everyone is quite crucial. Sure.
Okay, yeah, so this question is about how the culture Black culture informs linguistic analysis, and some examples of that.
Sure. So linguistically, Black folks in African American vernacular English have copula verbs. So the copula be is what we add to something to indicate continuous action. So if you have a picture of Cookie Monster not eating cookies, and you have Elmo eating a cookie, the answer to who's eating cookies is what? Elmo. The answer to who be eating cookies is Cookie Monster, because constant continuous action, right? So that copular verb be is that's one of the features of African American vernacular English. In addition to that, had also works that way, because had here is in front of a past perfect. So you don't actually need had in this in order for it to make sense. What happened is grammatically correct in the idiolect that many Americans speak. In African American vernacular English, it indicates past continuous action. Right? So those are some of the linguistic things that I think about. I also think about the dropping of, because poetry is about music, largely, I also think about the dropping of consonant clusters like ing, just chillin', right? I had to fight to get it with no accent mark on there. And also phrases and phraseology that only make sense in certain regions, right? If you ask a New Yorker what has happened, so boom, right? That's New York. You also know, people by other vernacular that they use, right? So when I think about that, and I think about how that kind of distills into poetry and distills into language, there are scholars like Geneva Smitherman that are really adept at thinking about Black linguistic structures. Rickford and Rickford, who come after Geneva Smitherman, they're a father-son duo or brother duo. They're related. And then also thinking about any of the scholars who study hip hop. And I'm thinking in particular Black feminist scholars. So you could go down the road of like Mark Anthony Neal and look at Jay-Z's Decoded and those folks. You could also start with Trisha Rose, who does one called Black Noise. And so I'd start there for a kind of more fulsome analysis. Not that there's anything wrong with Mark Anthony Neal or Jay-Z's Decoded, it's just that they're building off of the work that she's done. So I'd start there.
So we'll have our last question. Yeah, so this question is about what is it about certain artists that influences or has influenced the way that you wrote this book and the kinds of poetry that you write?
So in 1970, we have a turn in history, in the study of history and the study of literature. And it is when Black scholars begin writing history that is vastly different than their predecessors in the field. And their idea is that history is less an objective thing to study than it is a way that people make sense of the past and the present. And so when you think about that, when I think about that in terms of what that means for literature, it means that most of the folks writing in that space and writing from that space think about literature, history, and all other humanistic arts as a space of storytelling. So for me, the blurriness between them is really quite fruitful as an artist. As a scholar, it drives me crazy, but as an artist, I think it's quite useful. So when I think about Lil Wayne, right, and I have liked him from the 99 and the 2000s, when he was, young, when he was sweeping up Juvenile's detritus at the record studio, right? Thinking about his growth, thinking about his story, there's theory there. When he's talking about, the policewoman record, right? That's a theory about, surveillance and Black cops and desire and what it means to have those folks, in your bed, right? And in your mind. And A Milli as a comeback record is also, I think, a kind of braggadocious relationship to Hollygrove. And so when I think about that, I listen to a lot of problematic stuff. I listen to a lot of stuff that, if I have to explain it to a class, I'm like, it's not feminist. Yeah, it's a little anti-Black. Yeah, it's really problematic, but it slaps, right? Like, I like Glorilla. I'm not going to be out somewhere with booty shorts and showing my camel moose knuckle, whatever she says, because I'm older. Right, and it's also not my style. It was never my style. But when I think about those things, together, there's a theory there about her Black life, right? And so when I take seriously the artist, it means I'm taking seriously all artists. So in terms of this collection, the music that's here is Kim, Lil Kim, Quiet Storm Remix. That's one of the epigraphs. You've got Lil Wayne, you've got T-Boz in here, you've got, you've got a little Vivaldi, right? There's some French opera in here as well. You've got a little bit of jazz in some of the references, and you know, you've got that kind of twinkling music that people play when there's supposed to be a really lovely moment, when the characters are falling in love, or when there's so much tension. You've got some of that in there as well. But as I think about what the music is doing for me poetically, because I am not unstressed, stressed, that's a waltz.
Mm-hmm.
I am percussion. I am a samba beat. I'm thinking about all of those things, and that's the music from which I write. Yeah. So if you hear the lines, and they're going, the places where I sped up, the places where I slowed down, that's also the music, pace and tempo. Mm-hmm. So all of that is inspiring as a place from which to start.
Excellent, fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Let's give our visitor another round of applause. So we have some refreshments here. Please partake. I know that we also have books for sale, and Dr. Pickens will be available to sign your book if you're interested. But thank you so much for taking the time to come. And yeah, absolutely. Have a great rest of the semester.